Okay, guys, let's get started. Let's get started with today's lecture. Today, I want to talk to you about qualitative research and about qualitative interviews. So where does this fit in the overall scheme of things? Well, we talked about all sorts of different ways and how you actually do research, how you go out and how you collect data, because ultimately, you want to base your claims that you're making on data that you collected, on the real world. You want to know if it's actually really true, what you are suggesting, how things are related with each other or how things work. And we talked about a couple of different methods for how to do this. Like talked about how you conduct a survey. Remember we talked about how you formulate questions in surveys. In your assignment, you actually look through a bad survey and through a bad questionnaire, and then how to make that better, for example. And we talked about experiments at length, how you experiments you manipulate something, and then you kind of try to see what are the implications of that. We also talked about secondary data analysis. Remember before the break, I talked about how you can use data that already exists, and then you use that to make your analysis. So now we're talking about qualitative interviews, which is another way of collecting your data. And on Wednesday we'll continue on that. We'll talk a little about ethnographies. Okay, but this is sort of the stuff that I brought with me for today. So first I want to talk about qualitative research in general and how it might differ from quantitative research, which is what we did so far. Then I jump into interviews and different types of interviews. And actually, then first, I'm going to show you a bad and then a good interview. And lastly, we'll talk about 3 different purposes for this. Yeah? So the last 2 are in reverse order. So let's talk about qualitative research. What is it? What do we mean by that? Well, actually, it has nothing to do with high quality or low quality. Yeah, in that sense, this is sort of like a wrong word. Yeah, and I would never say that, let's say, one type of research is of higher quality than another type of research. It really depends on what you make out of it. But in the literature, we have this distinction between qualitative research and quantitative research. And when you look a little further into this, or even when you look into textbooks on how to do research methods, when I prepare for this lecture, for this course, I look at all different textbooks and think about what could I have you read and things like that. And there often you find this big distinction between qualitative and quantitative research. And when you look a little further and you look at sort of what do colleagues do, what do people like me or other professors at universities and sociology departments, what do they do? Well, you very quickly see that sociology is often very fragmented. So people do very different kinds of things. Well, I think that's a strength of the discipline. Yeah, we do all sorts of different things. But sometimes it's really hard to even communicate with people. So there are some sociology colleagues that I have incredibly hard time communicating with, because they almost speak like a different language. And so you find that across the discipline. But the key to remember is, and people used to have then these dichotomies and used to have big battles about, okay, I'm in the quantitative camp and I'm in the qualitative camp and things like that. I think this is utterly useless. I think this is a debate which is so yesterday. We don't have that anymore. It really depends at the end of the day what you want to do. And then you go and you choose the research method that is most appropriate to find out what you want to find out. That's sort of how you need to think about it. And as a good scholar, as a good researcher, as a good student, you need to be aware of both of these research traditions and both of these research approaches. So just saying all I do is interviews, actually this would be wrong. I would highly advise against that. If you want to get a job afterwards, you need to know about some statistics. It's incredibly important. I don't know, it's just where the jobs are. While at the same time, when you just say, okay, everything I'm going to take care of are numbers, you might miss out on the meanings of things. So it's very important to have these different aspects in it, and you will get both further qualitative and quantitative training in the second year. So it's very important to treat both of them seriously and equally. So, but what I think at the very first lecture I had a slide like this, different types of research that we can have. Some people say all we can do is interpret stuff. We can disclose meaning-making practices, and everything that we see are social constructions. Well, I'm a little skeptical about this. I think it's important to interpret things. It's important to find out what the meaning is. But I believe there is a social reality out there. Now, when you go out there, some people are objectively poorer than others. It's not just a social construction, but what poorness means and so on. Of course, these things matter. But some people just have lower income to play with every month than other people. Yeah. So I think there is an objective reality. It is what I believe in. Yeah? And I believe in that we need to be systematic using the scientific method to approach that. That doesn't mean that interpretations are useless. Yeah? So they are still important to make sense out of what we observe, but I think there is an underlying objectivity that we need to get hold of. Okay, then the next way of doing this could be, some people say, okay, let's describe stuff. And that's incredibly important. You want to know about social inequalities before you say anything about it further. Is there something like social inequality out there? Is there segregation out there? Yeah? For example, in my second year class, I'm teaching a course on segregation. It's how people are separated into different parts of social life. And I looked at, okay, how does it actually look like in Ireland? And then you find statistics like, okay, 80% of the schools in Ireland, that's sort of where, no, hang on, in 23% of the schools in Ireland, this is where 80% of the foreigners' kids go to school. It's highly segregated. Irish people go to one school, foreigners go to other schools. That's something that you want to describe, right? If you just go out and interpret stuff, you need to describe things. Yeah? How does the real world look like? And I think this is something how the real world actually what it is. So what, where, and when. This is sort of a descriptive part of research. And then, and hopefully I can convince you by that, because I think this is really what we ultimately should aim for. We want to explain stuff, or at least I want to explain stuff. I want to understand things. And in order to understand things, I want to know how did something come about. And if you want to change the social world, I think it's incredibly important to know how something comes about. Yeah. And sometimes things come about in ways that people themselves are completely unaware of. So the interpretation wouldn't get you very far because it's nothing about the individuals. They're not even aware of what's actually happening. And that's sort of one of the problems we'll talk about in a second. But traditionally, people thought about these different kind of research strategies. Quantitative strategy, often about statistics, their numbers, their surveys. It can be sophisticated, it can be very simple, like calculating some means and standard deviations, and we'll get to that in one of the next lectures. We'll do a little bit like that, not too much of it. Yeah. Basically, it's quantifying things, measuring things. While in contrast to that, we have what people call qualitative research, which are interviews, focus groups, ethnographies, and so on. And as I said, people used to be at odds with each other for these kind of things for a very long time. Some people still are, but I think it's utterly useless. Yeah? So I think the most productive research is actually when you combine these different things. So, for example, right now I'm working together with a colleague in Sweden, and she does completely different things than what I do. It's a research project about domestic violence. And I'm sort of like the quantitative stats guy. I do network analysis and things like that. Yeah. So I'm a numbers guy. And she does narrative analysis. So she has people tell her their stories. And then we kind of bring these two things together. So I find stuff that people wouldn't be aware of, even themselves not aware of. Right? While the narrative element on the other side adds meaning to what I'm doing on the other side. So I think this is sort of, think of this in a productive way, and in your studies, do both. So what is qualitative research? Well, qualitative research is this idea that maybe we cannot reduce things to numbers. And maybe we cannot just put a number on something, or even classify something. And maybe this rings a bell a little bit. When we talk about measurements, you realize, hang on, maybe it's actually not that easy to put a measurement on something. It would be too easy to say it's impossible, because I think we can measure a lot of things. Keep in mind things like, I don't know, there is unemployment, people have jobs, people have salaries. These are things that we can measure actually, and I think they're very important because they matter in an objective way. But qualitative research produces observations that are not easily reduced to numbers. And this includes a whole range of different data collection methods, including field notes, where people go out and write down their experiences about how they experience whatever. They go and people could go and see a rugby match and write down their field notes about how they experienced this rugby match. One-to-one or focus group interviews, different people come together and you talk about something. Actually, a while back I was in a focus group. Maybe I'll talk about that on Wednesday because I had some interesting experiences about this, how focus groups can completely derail. Yeah? You have a bunch of people and some people are very dominant in the conversation in a way, they completely take over. And then the other people don't say what they would have normally said. So maybe you already see some problems with that. But at the same time, it can also be positive. Yeah? As a researcher, you take yourself out of this whole thing. You kind of step back a little bit and let the people talk about stuff. You can do content analysis. So people do sometimes interesting things about newspapers, like what do people write about, or actually right now, one of my PhD students, he's doing a content analysis on Twitter about hashtag repeal the 8th. And so we collect all the data on this, and we look at what do people write about it, and we try to look at the content of this. What are the topics, in which context that people use this hashtag, and how do they tweet about it. So, but essentially, in a nutshell, to keep in mind, qualitative research is about stuff that is hard to measure. Now, it's hard to put a number on it. Instead, the idea is, in this case, to dig deep, to go down, to really go down, and try to understand more what is happening. The thing is, you're losing some other things. That's sort of why, I would say not the one is better over the other. Yeah? You're losing some other insights. So if you go deep, you might learn something about this one particular person, but you can impossibly say something about the population in Ireland anymore. And you see, this is sort of like a different approach. And sometimes it can be very helpful to complement these things. Or it allows you to learn about stuff that you didn't know about before. So qualitative research is actually good for exploration if you don't know exactly yet what you're looking for. Because if you would design a questionnaire and you just don't know the topics yet, how are you going to formulate the relevant questions? So this is sort of where qualitative interviews can be better in some ways. The general idea is that you try to see through the eyes of the other. So I interview somebody, and then I kind of try to understand how is that person thinking, taking the role of the other and understanding the meanings that people attribute to their world. And this can lead to unexpected findings. Okay, then the social setting in this context matters, and sometimes it's also called thick descriptions. But you can read more about that. You'll have whole lectures about that in the second year. What I want to talk about is this year. So originally here we had like quantitative and qualitative research designs, and traditionally people used to think, okay, well, quantitative research design are good for testing theories, which is sort of what we did so far. Like there's a theory, remember we had like, at the very beginning we talked about deduction and induction, we have theories and we want to test with observations. And this is actually where quantitative research traditionally used to be very good in explanatory research and looking at the reality. While in contrast, qualitative research used to be, that's how people thought about theory building, or so coming up with new ideas, or being explorative in how you look at things. Well, as I said, I'm skeptical towards this distinction, because I think nowadays I think you can use both research strategies to test theories. I think you can equally go and use qualitative interviews to go and test theories, while in the same way you can use quantitative research design to build new theories. Yeah? So this is basically why I'm saying, okay, this is just bollocks, this is just bullshit, and nowadays we can use both. So if somebody comes along and tells you there are different fault lines, don't buy into that. At the same time, stay open and kind of engage with both research strategies. At the end of the day, these fault lines are, in my opinion, useless. It is about what you want to study, what you want to research, and how are you going to be best at that. What is the best strategy in your particular context, or for your research question? Ultimately, I started this whole thing with the research question at the very beginning. I think this is the primary. This is what should drive all of this. What is your research question? How am I going to get at this research question? Okay, let me talk about some strengths and some weaknesses of qualitative research design, and then I quickly want to move on to interviews. So qualitative research can generate new theories. Now people sometimes think, okay, I don't want to read about anything at all, I'm just going to start talking with people, and then something bubbles up. But you can see how other people might criticize that, including me, for then saying, hang on, you're making yourself life too easy here. Yeah? You're just rambling off. You're just talking about whatever. This is not systematic at all. You need to have some idea about what you are doing. It can produce unexpected findings, but as I said, you can equally have unexpected findings in quantitative research as well. Although there you are sort of constrained by your measurements to begin with. What are weaknesses of qualitative research? So some people would say, okay, well, it's very subjective. And that's an important one, yeah? Because you will see in a second, I show you a video about an interview. The interviewer can get very much involved in things. And that can be problematic, yeah? If you lose objectivity because of that. At the same time, you need to have a certain kind of involvement. That's not like the problem. If you're kind of talking with somebody and you're ice cold, this other person is not going to tell you anything. So you want to open up to that person. That's actually what we call a rapport. You want to build up rapport with the interviewee in order for the interviewer to feel at ease to tell you stuff. If you don't manage that, but it's sort of like the fine line, because you could slip off into subjectivity too much. It's incredibly difficult to replicate, which is sort of, again, also one of the criticisms, because, I don't know, you do some research, and I try to replicate it, but it's very difficult. Why? Because there's no standardized way of measuring something. So maybe you just asked the question in a completely different way than I did, or the whole conversation evolved in a different way. So you see how this is sort of actually the opposite to the lab experiments that we talked about last time, where everything is very controlled and you can replicate things all over the world. It's difficult to generalize, but we'll talk more about sampling next week. And sometimes there's a lack of transparency. So what did the researcher actually do? Okay, but let me now talk about interviews, and then maybe some of these things become a little clearer. So what are interviews? So qualitative interviews. In contrast to survey interviewing, I don't know, I would sit down and read down the questions and then tick boxes, or I don't know, I put in numbers depending on what you said to me. Qualitative interviews is a set of topics that are being discussed in depth rather than based on the use of standardized questions. You know, it's almost like having a conversation. They are less structured, they're less standardized, they try to take the participant's viewpoint. Sometimes they actually encourage rambling off the topic, to kind of get to these things that you didn't know about before. You want the interviewee to tell you something that you didn't know before. They are sometimes more flexible, but at the same time, this requires then skill as well. How, as a researcher, do you do that? How are you good in having an interview? Okay, I briefly talked about rapport already. Rapport is basically this idea that you need to have some sort of connectivity, some sort of connection to the person you're interviewing in order for that person to open up. Yeah? If I'm ice cold to somebody, this person is not going to talk to me. So you need to develop some sort of empathy, some sort of way of kind of connecting to that person while maintaining your objectivity. And that's sort of where the skill comes into play in how you do that. But if you don't establish rapport, and you'll see an example in a second, it's difficult. It's difficult or interviews can go terribly wrong. Okay, briefly, 3 types before I actually give you some examples of interviews, and then we're going to watch a longer video in that context. So different interviews, very shortly, different types of it. It is about the level of control that we have. How much do we control the situation? This is actually a control room of NASA in Houston, where I happened to be last year, which is very exciting, because this is where the Apollo capsule was launched. Anyway, so it's about the control that we have. It's about the control over the situation. And when you have no control, it's almost like a conversation. Yeah? Researcher is required to recollect the discussion. There's no fixed topics, there's no fixed questions, and it's just rambling off. And that's what some people do. And to some degree, this is sort of what my co-author in Sweden does. She just has a chat. She has a coffee with folks, and afterwards she tells me about it. And then I'm sitting there and I'm utterly frustrated because then I say, Margareta, what am I going to do with this now? Yeah. So how am I going to put that in a network plot? Because ultimately this is what I'm doing. We want to establish the network around domestic violence and about who knows about what when the whole thing happens. Okay, but then it can be more levels. Let's introduce a little more control into this. Interviews can be unstructured, ethnographic interviewing, for example. So here the idea is that there are some fixed topics that you want to cover. Let's say you have in your mind, I want to get to that topic, I want to talk to you about, I don't know, education, I want to talk to you about your relationship to your parents, or something like that. But the actual questions are not really fixed. Then you can have a semi-structured interview where you have an interview guide, which is sort of more detailed in about what you want to cover and the order in which you want to go at these kind of things. There's sort of certain question sequences that you have, question formulations might be fixed. And at the end you have a structured interview, which is essentially like a survey, like a questionnaire, yeah? But instead of giving it to the participant, you read it out. So these are sort of like different levels of controls that we can have in an interview. Okay, what I'm going to do now, I want to show you an example of bad and good interviewing, and it's going to be an example of a semi-structured interview. So the researcher has some ideas, and there are certain topics that the researcher wants to talk about, but you'll see two different versions of this. And it is going to be an interview about driving a car, like how the experiences are around that in a way. So it's about driving, you're driving a car. And what I want you to do, first I'm going to show you one video, and I want you to do while watching this video, I want you to pay attention to it, and I want you to focus on, not so much on the content, but on how this interview is being conducted. Yeah, how does the interviewer behave, and how does the interviewee react? And so I want you to watch that video. I'm going to switch the audio in a second, and then I want you to take 2 minutes and discuss with your neighbor what the interviewer did wrong. Yeah. That's sort of the idea. And then afterwards we're going to see the same video again, but then in a slightly different light. Yeah? Okay, so that's sort of the task. Let me switch things over, and then we go ahead.
Hello. Come in. Sit down. Thanks for coming to talk to me today. How long have you been driving, Amanda?
13 years.
Right. And what's driving like for you?
Usually I enjoy it, but sometimes it's stressful.
Right. Oh, okay. And what was it like learning to drive? And how long did it take you?
Learning to drive was nerve-wracking.
And was it stressful then, taking a test?
Yeah, it was stressful, but it was really nervous.
Right. Okay. Thanks for talking to me today.
Okay, take the 2 minutes and talk about this. Yeah? And then we're going to watch the video again and I'll talk about it. Okay guys, let's move on. I'm not going to switch back the mic because now we're going to watch the video again, with some comment on it. Yeah? So now we're going to watch the same video again, and afterwards you're going to see a second version of the same interview, which hopefully shows you how this actually should be. Yeah?
Well, let's see that again.
Oh, hi. Come in. Come in. Sit down. Thanks for coming to talk to me today. How long have you been driving under?
Well, that was a very brief introduction. The interviewer didn't explain the context of the interview, who she was, or what the research was about, and there was no consideration of any ethical issues at all.
How long have you been driving under?
13 years.
Right. And what's driving like for you?
Notice the lack of eye contact here. The interviewer seems to be simply reading the questions. She's not making any attempt to build any kind of rapport with the interviewee.
And what's driving like for you?
Usually I enjoy it, but sometimes it's stressful.
Right. Oh, okay.
Notice that the interviewer just simply accepts the short answers to her questions and makes no attempts to give any prompts or any follow-up questions. For example, she could ask the interviewee why driving is enjoyable, or even better, ask her to give an example of when it's enjoyable.
And what was it like learning to drive, and how long did it take you?
Change of topic, the much better question, what was it like? However, it's then spoiled by the second question, how long did it take?
Learning to drive was nerve-wracking.
And was it stressful then, taking the test?
Notice the long pause here. The interviewee is clearly thinking about the stress of learning to drive, but the interviewer offers no probe at this point, no further investigation. And in fact, next the question changes the topic again to the test itself.
Was it stressful then, taking the test?
Yeah, it was stressful. Yeah, 3 years.
Right.
The question about stress invites a yes or no answer, and that's exactly what the interviewer gets. He needs a follow-up question about, for example, why was it stressful? But this is not forthcoming.
Okay. Thanks for talking to me today.
And so the interview ends rather suddenly, without the interviewer having found out very much at all about what Amanda, the interviewee, thinks about driving or learning to drive. Notice that the interviewee, Amanda, seems rather ill at ease and is not very forthcoming with information. The interview also ends very suddenly. There's no chance for the interviewee to add anything else which she might have thought of. Now let's look at the second version of the interview, where the interviewer makes a much better job of addressing some of the problems I've outlined in the case of the first interview. Notice also how she makes a much better job of establishing a rapport with the interviewee, and consequently gets much more information about what she thinks about driving and learning to drive.
Hello, Amanda. Come in, hi. Sit down, make yourself comfortable. Thanks for coming along today to talk to me. I hope that this sort of experience of us going to this interview this afternoon will be pleasant and interesting for both of us. As you know, the aim of the research really is to find out a little bit more about what people's experience of driving is like, particularly learning to drive and events around learning to drive, like taking the test, for example. And as I explained before in the participant information sheet, the reason that I asked you is because I'm aware that you're a driver, and I wanted to find out a little bit more about what your own personal experience of learning to drive has been about. Now, I'm not expecting the interview to last very long, probably only about 10 minutes or so. And I just need to check out a few things with you before you get started. I know that when we spoke earlier, you agreed to take part in the interview, but I just want to check that's still okay with you.
Yes, it's fine.
Great, that's brilliant. Now, it's important to let you know that if you want to stop at any time or you want to take a break, you can. And if I was to ask you a question that you didn't want to answer, please feel free to just say, I'm sorry, I don't want to talk about that. That's absolutely fine. And as we agreed earlier, the whole purpose of using this interview will be for the research, but also to use the interview for teaching purposes. Can I just check that's okay?
Fine.
Lovely, thanks. Do you have any questions for me before we get started?
No, I think I'm happy, yeah.
Okay, right, that's lovely then. Okay. Can you tell me how long you've been driving?
I've been driving for 13 years.
My gosh, 13 years, okay. And can you tell me something about the feelings that you associate with driving?
I think mainly when I'm driving, I really enjoy the freedom that I can just go where I want, when I want. And although it can be stressful when you get stuck in traffic, but when you go on public transport, you're very much waiting around and it can not turn up, and that's really frustrating. Right. So I really like the freedom that it gives me.
We mentioned there about stress and it feeling stressful. Can you perhaps give me a bit of an example or tell me about a time when...
Just like when you get stuck behind someone who's really slow or there's a really bad traffic, there's nothing you can do, just stop there, it can make you late, but you can't do anything, you just have to wait till the traffic moves on. That can be annoying.
Okay, that's great, thanks. One of the things that I'm particularly interested in finding out about are people's memories of their experiences. And in particular, the sort of stories that people tell of events that might happen to them or their experiences of certain times in their lives. And I particularly want to ask you about that in relation to your driving behaviour. What I'd like to ask you to do is to think back to a specific point in time when you were learning to drive. Maybe a specific experience or maybe a particular lesson. And tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I can remember when I was learning to drive, I was learning to drive in my car, but my mum had lent it to a friend because obviously I couldn't drive on at the time. And so the deal was that they took me out for practice every week and they got to borrow the car. And of course it caused a bit of a clash of interest because it wasn't very interesting for me to pass my test because I let him take the car back. So when I was learning to drive, it made it uncomfortable because I was kind of aware of that, and I felt sometimes he was a bit undermining of my driving rather than encouraging me because he had his own, like I say, he probably didn't want to take the car back. And I can also remember, he was really nervous eating sweets because I'd go too fast. I remember approaching a dual carriageway too quickly and literally screeching like in a movie around, barely having control of the car. So I think he tolerated quite a few incidences, near misses and stuff.
Wow, near misses, that's interesting. Tell me about it. What about in the end?
Well, just, the driving a bit too fast and having to brake heavily and just inexperience really. And learning to have control of the car.
So that's two quite separate feelings. Remember when I asked you a question before we were talking about a feeling of freedom that driving gives you now. How does that compare to that feeling of that you want out there about visitors?
I think I was desperate to pass into the lived in a small village, right miles away from the nearest town. So it was really important for me to be able to drive to get to college. So I think there was some real anxiousness to pass, and that learning to control the car can really difficult for understanding how gears and stuff work and how learning what speeds you should approach corners and whatever. So I think I was looking forward to passing that test so I had that freedom.
Great, that's great, thanks. Okay, what I'd like to do now is get you to think back to the driving test itself.
Yeah.
take some time to think about how you felt at the time of your test, and maybe about some of the events that happened in your test, and tell me the story of the test, perhaps by starting at the beginning and working your way through to the end.
Right. Well, I can remember on my test, just as we got out of the test centre I stored, I think everybody does that, so I read it. So I think they kind of overlooked that. And then I can remember, I was doing my best because, as I said, I was really keen to pass and get on with driving. And I can remember, I don't know, so I think that was enough for you.
Yeah. How did it feel when you won it?
I was exhilarated, I was so happy. I went straight home and went round to the fence house to tell about the test. I had the coffee. And I was like, really, well done, but it was great. And I went off for a drive. Went back free at last. I could go off and do anything. So I was for a week. I was like, you know what I did? It's a shock.
That's great. Thanks ever so much for sharing that with me and talking to me about your experience. That's really all the questions that I have for you. Do you have any questions that you want to ask me?
No,
Okay, so that is a very different kind of interview. That was very, very different, and how you can see how the first interviewer didn't really get very much out of this whole thing. It was pretty useless. And how the second time, there's sort of like experience skill coming into play, and how to probe in certain questions, kind of dig deeper, give the respondent some space and time to think about it, not forcing yes or no questions. The whole other issue of rapport, you saw how there was sort of like a connection being built up between the two. It was almost like a conversation. The idea here is, what the interviewer tries to do here is to make the interviewee as comfortable as possible. Because genuinely this is sort of when they tell you more. If you're kind of in a very uncomfortable situation, you're not going to respond well to the situation. You're not going to give good answers, or actually you're not going to tell what you actually think about in this context. So it's a very different setup, and this is sort of the big difference between how an interview can be really bad and how, in contrast, the second one is actually really good. She really probed further in, she asked about experiences, about how the respondent felt in these situations, and so on and so forth. Yeah. But it was also structured in a certain way. There were sort of like clear topics that she wanted to cover. So it was not just rambling off. There was sort of like an idea behind that, while actually for the respondent it actually felt like a normal conversation. So a very different scenario. So I have also 3 purposes of interviews, but we might talk about that at the next time. So it's basically different ways in how you can think about interviews and what they actually do, but we'll talk about that next time. And I don't get the slide, but anyway, there's no reading for Wednesday. If you haven't done the one for today, do that and read more. Yeah, see you on Wednesday.